Part 1. The Birth of a Rebel Mind. Friedrich Wilhelm Nietzsche was born on October 15, 1844, in the small Prussian village of Rücken, into a world defined by faith, discipline, and inherited certainty. His father, Karl Ludwig Nietzsche, was a Lutheran pastor, and religion was not simply practiced in the household. It structured daily life, morality, and identity. From the beginning, Nietzsche's environment was shaped by biblical language, obedience to divine authority, and a strong moral code grounded in Protestant tradition. It seemed almost predetermined that he would follow in his father's footsteps and become a servant of the church. Yet the story of Nietzsche begins not with stability, but with rupture. When he was only 5 years old, his father died after suffering from a severe neurological illness. Shortly afterward, his younger brother Joseph also passed away. These early confrontations with death deeply scarred the sensitive child. The experience of loss was not abstract. It was immediate and devastating. In a single stroke, Nietzsche lost both paternal authority and familial security. Death entered his consciousness not as theological doctrine, but as an intimate reality. After his father's death, Nietzsche's family moved to Naumburg, where he was raised in a household dominated by women. His mother Franziska, his grandmother, and 2 unmarried aunts. The atmosphere was loving but strict, pious yet emotionally intense. Young Friedrich grew up surrounded by moral seriousness and religious expectation. The absence of a father figure, combined with the weight of female guardianship and religious discipline, created a complex psychological environment that shaped his later reflections on authority, weakness, and power. From an early age, Nietzsche displayed remarkable intellectual gifts. He was quiet, introspective, and unusually mature for his years. While other children played, Nietzsche preferred reading, composing music, and writing poetry. He showed exceptional talent in classical languages, and his teachers quickly recognized his brilliance. His academic excellence earned him admission to Schulpforta, one of Germany's most prestigious and rigorous boarding schools. Schulpforta was not merely a school. It was an intellectual crucible. Students were immersed in Greek and Latin texts, disciplined study routines, and strict moral codes. Nietzsche excelled in this environment, mastering ancient languages and absorbing the spirit of classical antiquity. He developed a deep admiration for Greek culture, especially Greek tragedy. The works of Homer, Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Plato became central to his intellectual formation. Greek tragedy fascinated Nietzsche because it confronted suffering directly. Unlike Christianity, which promised redemption beyond the world, Greek tragedy embraced suffering as inseparable from existence. It did not deny pain. It transformed it into art. This tragic worldview planted a seed in Nietzsche's mind. Perhaps greatness is not achieved by escaping suffering, but by affirming it. During these formative years, Nietzsche also cultivated his passion for music. He composed piano pieces and dreamed at times of becoming a musician. Music represented for him a direct access to emotion and instinct, something deeper than rational thought. This early love for music would later connect him to one of the most important figures of his intellectual life, Richard Wagner. After completing his education at Schulpforta, Nietzsche enrolled at the University of Bonn in 1864 to study theology and classical philology. Initially, it appeared that he might continue along the religious path expected of him. However, his faith was already beginning to weaken. The academic study of theology exposed him to historical criticism of the Bible and emerging scientific skepticism. The sacred texts he had once accepted as divine revelation began to appear as historical documents shaped by human authors. Within a year, Nietzsche abandoned theology and transferred fully to classical philology at the University of Leipzig. This decision marked a quiet but decisive break from the religious identity of his upbringing. In Leipzig, Nietzsche encountered the philosophy of Arthur Schopenhauer. Reading The World as Will and Representation was a transformative experience. Nietzsche later described discovering Schopenhauer as if he had found a mirror reflecting his deepest intuitions. Schopenhauer argued that beneath the surface of rational thought lies a blind, striving force he called the will. Life, in this view, is driven by endless desire and therefore by suffering. For a young man already marked by loss and introspection, this philosophy resonated profoundly. Yet even in admiration, Nietzsche sensed that Schopenhauer's pessimism was incomplete. While Schopenhauer advocated renunciation and denial of desire, Nietzsche felt drawn toward confrontation and transformation. In 1869, at the astonishing age of 24, Nietzsche was appointed professor of classical philology at the University of Basel in Switzerland. It was an extraordinary achievement. He had not yet completed a formal doctoral dissertation in the traditional sense. His intellectual reputation was already formidable. To the academic world, he was a rising star. However, beneath the surface of professional success, Nietzsche experienced deep restlessness. Philology, the precise study of ancient texts, began to feel insufficient. He was not content to analyze grammar and historical context. He wanted to question the foundations of morality, religion, and culture. His interests were expanding beyond scholarship into philosophy, psychology, and cultural criticism. During his early years in Basel, Nietzsche formed a close friendship with Richard Wagner. Wagner embodied for him the possibility of cultural renewal through art. Nietzsche believed that Wagner's music might revive the tragic spirit of ancient Greece and restore vitality to modern Europe. Their relationship was intense, intellectually stimulating, and emotionally charged. Nietzsche saw in Wagner a father figure, mentor, and revolutionary artist. Yet even in this period of admiration, tension simmered beneath the surface. Nietzsche's independent spirit resisted complete allegiance to any authority. His thinking was becoming increasingly radical. He began to suspect that Christianity, morality, and even modern rationalism were suppressing the full potential of human strength and creativity. Meanwhile, Nietzsche's health deteriorated rapidly. He suffered from chronic migraines, digestive disorders, insomnia, and progressive vision problems. These illnesses would haunt him for the rest of his life. Physical suffering forced him into isolation and limited his academic activities, but it also intensified his introspection. Illness became not merely a burden, but a philosophical laboratory. He began asking himself, can suffering become a source of strength? Can pain be transformed into power? By the mid-1870s, Nietzsche stood at a crossroads. He was a respected professor, yet increasingly alienated from academia. He was raised as a Christian, yet steadily losing faith. He admired cultural authority figures, yet instinctively rebelled against them. His intellectual journey was moving toward rupture. The child of a pastor was slowly becoming the critic of Christianity. The disciplined scholar was evolving into a philosophical revolutionary. The sensitive boy marked by loss was preparing to declare that suffering is not an argument against life, but its deepest justification. This first stage of Nietzsche's life laid the psychological and intellectual foundation for everything that followed. The early tragedies, rigorous education, encounters with Schopenhauer, friendship with Wagner, and battle with illness combined to forge a mind that would soon challenge the very structure of Western morality. The rebel had not yet spoken his most dangerous words, but the conditions for their birth were already in place. Part 2. The Collapse of Illusions and the Birth of a Radical Vision. Friedrich Nietzsche. If the first stage of Nietzsche's life forged his intellectual foundation, the second stage shattered his remaining illusions. It was during his years in Basel and the decade that followed that Friedrich Nietzsche transformed from a brilliant academic into one of the most dangerous and original philosophical voices in European history. At the University of Basel, Nietzsche initially appeared to embody academic success. He lectured on Greek philology, classical literature, and ancient culture with extraordinary depth and originality. Students admired his brilliance. Colleagues recognize his rare intellectual intensity. Yet Nietzsche himself felt increasingly suffocated. The academic world demanded caution, methodical precision, and respect for established frameworks. Nietzsche, however, was beginning to think in explosions rather than footnotes. His first major philosophical work, The Birth of Tragedy, 1872, marked a turning point. In this book, Nietzsche introduced the tension between the Apollonian and the Dionysian forces in Greek culture. The Apollonian represented order, structure, clarity, and rational form. The Dionysian represented chaos, instinct, intoxication, and primal energy. Nietzsche argued that the greatness of ancient Greek tragedy emerged from the dynamic interplay between these two forces. But beneath this cultural analysis lay a deeper argument. Nietzsche believed modern Europe had become excessively Apollonian, rational, scientific, moralistic, and detached from instinctual vitality. Christianity, in his view, intensified this imbalance by glorifying humility, obedience, and self-denial. Instead of affirming life's intensity, European culture suppressed it. The book was not well received by many classical scholars. They criticized its speculative style and philosophical tone. Nietzsche realized he was drifting away from philology and towards something far more radical, a total critique of culture. During this period, his relationship with Richard Wagner began to unravel. Initially, Nietzsche saw Wagner as a cultural savior, someone capable of restoring Dionysian depth through music. Wagner's operas seemed to embody heroic struggle and mythic power. Nietzsche admired him deeply, almost reverently. However, as Wagner's work increasingly embraced German nationalism and Christian symbolism, Nietzsche grew disillusioned. He felt that Wagner had betrayed the revolutionary spirit of art and retreated into moral romanticism. Their eventual break was both intellectual and emotional. Wagner represented authority, charisma, and cultural power. By separating from him, Nietzsche symbolically severed his last attachment to external authority. This rupture intensified Nietzsche's isolation. At the same time, his physical health deteriorated severely. He suffered from blinding headaches, violent nausea, and near paralysis during episodes of illness. By 1879, his condition forced him to resign from his professorship. At only 35 years old, he abandoned a stable academic career. What appeared as failure was, in truth, liberation. Freed from institutional constraints, Nietzsche became a wandering thinker. He lived modestly, moving between Switzerland, Italy, and southern France in search of climates that might relieve his symptoms. Alone, financially strained, and socially isolated, he entered the most productive period of his intellectual life. It was during these wandering years that Nietzsche's philosophy hardened into something revolutionary. In works such as Human, All Too Human, and The Gay Science, he launched a systematic critique of morality, religion, and truth itself. One of his most famous declarations emerged during this time: God is dead. This statement was not a triumphal proclamation of atheism. It was a diagnosis of cultural collapse. Nietzsche argued that modern science, historical criticism, and intellectual honesty had undermined belief in a transcendent moral authority. Europe had killed its own God, not through violence, but through enlightenment. But Nietzsche's real concern was not theological, it was existential. If God is dead, then the moral framework built upon divine authority collapses. Concepts such as absolute good and evil, eternal truth, and sacred law lose their foundation. Humanity stands alone in a universe without predetermined meaning. Nietzsche saw this as the dawn of nihilism, the belief that life lacks inherent value or purpose. He predicted that Europe would experience a profound spiritual crisis as traditional values disintegrated. This crisis, he believed, could lead either to despair or to transformation. Rather than retreat into pessimism like Arthur Schopenhauer, Nietzsche chose confrontation. He refused resignation. Instead, he sought a way to overcome nihilism through the creation of new values. During this period, he developed the concept of the will to power. For Nietzsche, life is not primarily driven by survival or pleasure. It is driven by expansion, growth, and the assertion of strength. Every living being strives not merely to exist, but to express its force, overcome resistance, and shape its environment. Even morality, Nietzsche argued, is an expression of this deeper will. What societies call good often reflects the interests of the powerful or the resentful. Moral systems are not eternal truths. They are human constructions shaped by psychological and social forces. Nietzsche introduced a powerful distinction between master morality and slave morality. Master morality emerges from strength, confidence, and self-affirmation. It defines good as noble, powerful, and life-affirming. Slave morality, by contrast, arises from resentment. It defines good as humility, obedience, and weakness, virtues that serve the powerless by condemning strength as evil. In this radical revaluation of values, Nietzsche positioned himself as a philosophical revolutionary. He did not merely criticize Christianity, he attempted to dismantle the moral architecture of Western civilization. Yet during his lifetime, almost no one understood him. His books sold poorly. He lived in obscurity. He had few close friends. Letters often went unanswered. Publishers were hesitant. To the world, he seemed eccentric, unstable, marginal. But in solitude, Nietzsche sharpened his vision. Isolation became a forge. He wrote in aphorisms, short, striking statements designed to provoke rather than comfort. His style became poetic, psychological, and explosive. He was no longer writing for professors. He was writing for the future. This second phase of his life represents the collapse of inherited certainty. The pastor's son had rejected faith. The professor had abandoned academia. The disciple had broken with his master. Illness had stripped him of stability. In that emptiness, Nietzsche began constructing one of the most daring philosophical projects in modern history, the creation of new values in a world without God. The next stage of his journey would introduce his most iconic and controversial concept, the Übermensch, and his call for humanity to overcome itself. Part 3, The Overman, Eternal Return, and the Philosophy of Self-Overcoming, Friedrich Nietzsche. By the early 1880s, Nietzsche had entered the most intense and creative period of his life. He was no longer a professor, no longer a disciple of Wagner, no longer a believer in Christianity, and no longer bound by academic expectations. What remained was a solitary thinker wandering through the mountains of Switzerland and the sunlit landscapes of Italy, carrying notebooks filled with explosive ideas. Out of this isolation emerged the core of his philosophical vision, a vision centered on self-overcoming, the Übermensch, and the eternal return. Nietzsche's years in places like Sils Maria in the Swiss Alps were both physically painful and intellectually electrifying. His health continued to deteriorate. Migraines struck with unbearable force. His eyesight weakened to the point where he could barely read or write without agony. Yet in these moments of physical fragility, his thought reached extraordinary intensity. Nietzsche believed that suffering sharpened perception. He often described himself as a philosopher of the future, writing for readers not yet born. In 1883, he began publishing what would become his most famous and poetic work, Thus Spoke Zarathustra. This book marked a dramatic shift in tone and ambition. It was not a conventional philosophical treatise. It was written as a prophetic narrative centered on the figure of Zarathustra, a wandering sage who descends from the mountains to proclaim a new message to humanity. Through Zarathustra, Nietzsche introduced one of his most provocative ideas, the Übermensch, often translated as the Overman or Superman. The Übermensch was not a biological evolution, nor a political ruler, nor a simple metaphor for strength. It represented the next stage of human development, an individual capable of creating new values after the collapse of traditional morality. If God is dead, Nietzsche argued, then humanity must become the creator of meaning. The Übermensch is the one who accepts this responsibility. Rather than longing for divine guidance, he embraces existence fully and affirms life without appeal to transcendent authority. The Übermensch does not obey inherited moral codes. He generates his own. Nietzsche framed humanity as a bridge, not an endpoint. Man is something that shall be overcome, Zarathustra declares. In this vision, human beings are transitional, caught between animal instinct and higher self-creation. The task of the future is not comfort or equality, but transformation. Central to this transformation is the concept of self-overcoming. For Nietzsche, greatness arises not from domination of others, but from mastery of oneself. The strongest individual is the one who confronts internal weakness, fear, resentment, and transforms them into creative force. Self-overcoming is a perpetual process, a continuous revaluation of one's own limitations. Another profound idea introduced during this period was the doctrine of eternal recurrence, or eternal return. Nietzsche posed a radical thought experiment. What if you had to live your life again and again, infinitely, exactly as it has occurred, every joy, every mistake, every suffering, repeated eternally? Would you curse this fate, or would you affirm it? The eternal return is not primarily a cosmological theory. It is an ethical challenge. To live as if you would willingly repeat your life forever is to live with radical affirmation. It demands responsibility, courage, and love of fate, what Nietzsche called amor fati. Instead of resenting suffering or wishing events had been different, one embraces existence in its totality. This idea represented Nietzsche's ultimate response to nihilism. If life lacks predetermined meaning, then meaning must be affirmed through one's attitude toward existence. Eternal recurrence forces the individual to confront whether they truly accept their life. It is the ultimate test of affirmation. Nietzsche's philosophy during this period also deepened his critique of herd mentality. He believed modern society encouraged conformity, mediocrity, and safety. Democratic equality, in his view, risks suppressing exceptional individuals. He did not oppose equality in a political sense so much as spiritually. He feared a culture that prioritized comfort over greatness. The individual, for Nietzsche, must resist the gravitational pull of the herd. True independence requires courage to stand alone. Nietzsche's own life mirrored this principle. His books sold poorly. Few readers understood him. He had no institutional platform. Yet he continued writing with prophetic intensity. Stylistically, Nietzsche became increasingly bold. Thus, Spoke Zarathustra is lyrical, symbolic, and filled with dramatic imagery. It reads like scripture, but scripture without a God. This was intentional. Nietzsche sought to replace the moral authority of religious texts with a philosophy that demanded strength rather than obedience. The figure of Zarathustra descends from solitude to teach, but is repeatedly rejected or misunderstood. This narrative reflects Nietzsche's own experience. He saw himself as a herald of a coming transformation, yet one whose message would not be fully grasped in his lifetime. During this period, Nietzsche also refined his understanding of the will to power. Life, he argued, is fundamentally an expression of expansion and intensification. The will to power is not simply political dominance. It is the drive toward growth, creativity, and self-transcendence. Even art, philosophy, and morality are expressions of this deeper dynamic. Importantly, Nietzsche rejected passive pessimism. Although influenced by Arthur Schopenhauer in his youth, he now opposed Schopenhauer's call for denial of desire. Instead of escaping the will, Nietzsche demanded its transformation. Strength lies not in suppressing instinct, but in directing it creatively. This third phase of Nietzsche's life represents the peak of his constructive philosophy. He was no longer merely dismantling Christianity or critiquing morality. He was proposing a new vision of humanity, one defined by courage, creativity, and radical affirmation. Yet this creative explosion came at immense personal cost. Nietzsche's isolation deepened, his mental strain intensified, his prophetic tone became sharper, more urgent. He sensed both the magnitude of his ideas and the likelihood that he would not live to see their impact. The philosopher who once sought academic recognition had become something else entirely, a solitary visionary attempting to prepare humanity for a post-religious age. The final chapters of his life would bring both intellectual culmination and tragic collapse. Part 4. Collapse, Madness, and the Silent Rise of a Philosopher, Friedrich Nietzsche. By the late 1880s, Nietzsche's creative fire reached its most intense and dangerous height. Between 1886 and 1888, he produced an extraordinary sequence of works: Beyond Good and Evil, On the Genealogy of Morality, The Case of Wagner, Twilight of the Idols, The Antichrist, and Ecce Homo. The speed, clarity, and aggression of these writings were astonishing. It was as if Nietzsche sensed time running out and sought to condense his entire philosophical revolution into a final burst of intellectual lightning. In Beyond Good and Evil, he attacked traditional philosophy itself. He argued that philosophers were not seekers of objective truth, but creators of systems that reflected their own psychological drives. Truth, in Nietzsche's view, was not neutral. It was shaped by perspective. Every claim to absolute objectivity concealed hidden motives. This idea would later influence existentialism, psychoanalysis, and postmodern thought. In On the Genealogy of Morality, Nietzsche offered one of his most systematic critiques of Christian ethics. He traced the origins of moral values historically and psychologically, arguing that concepts such as guilt, sin, and humility emerged not from divine command, but from social power dynamics. Slave morality, born from resentment, inverted noble values and elevated weakness into virtue. For Nietzsche, this inversion was a profound cultural event that shaped European civilization. His tone during this period became increasingly sharp, provocative, and uncompromising. In The Antichrist, he launched a fierce attack on Christianity, calling it a life-denying religion that glorified suffering and condemned strength. He did not merely criticize Christian doctrine, he accused it of weakening the human spirit. Yet alongside this intellectual clarity, signs of psychological instability were emerging. Nietzsche's isolation had become extreme. He had few close companions. His relationship with his sister, Elizabeth Forster Nietzsche, was strained and complex. Elizabeth held nationalist and anti-Semitic views that Nietzsche strongly rejected, yet she would later play a controversial role in shaping his legacy. In 1888, Nietzsche wrote Ecce Homo, a deeply autobiographical work in which he reflected on his life and ideas. The book's tone oscillates between brilliant self-analysis and grandiose declarations. He described himself as dynamite and suggested that his philosophy would divide history into before and after. These statements have often been interpreted as signs of emerging mania, yet they also reveal Nietzsche's awareness of the radical nature of his thought. Then, in January 1889, in the city of Turin, everything collapsed. According to the most famous account, Nietzsche witnessed a horse being whipped in the street. Overcome with emotion, he reportedly ran toward the animal, threw his arms around its neck, and burst into tears. Shortly afterward, he suffered a complete mental breakdown. He began writing incoherent letters signed Dionysus and the Crucified. His language became fragmented and delusional. The exact medical cause of his collapse remains debated. Some scholars suggest neurosyphilis. Others propose a genetic neurological disorder or bipolar illness. What is certain is that Nietzsche never recovered. At the age of 44, his productive intellectual life ended. He was taken first to a psychiatric clinic in Basel and later cared for by his mother. After her death, Elizabeth assumed responsibility for him. For the remaining 11 years of his life, Nietzsche lived in a state of mental silence, physically present but intellectually absent. The man who had challenged God, morality, and European civilization no longer spoke coherently. He died on August 25, 1900. At the time of his death, Nietzsche was not widely recognized. His books had sold modestly. He had no large following. To many, he remained an obscure and eccentric thinker. It would take decades for his ideas to ignite the intellectual world. Yet even during his lifetime of silence, the seeds of his influence were germinating. Elizabeth Forster Nietzsche played a decisive and controversial role in this process. She edited and organized his unpublished notes, sometimes rearranging and altering them. Her political sympathies later aligned with German nationalism, and she presented Nietzsche's philosophy in ways that sometimes distorted his intentions. This would contribute to future misinterpretations, including associations with ideologies Nietzsche himself would likely have opposed. Despite these distortions, serious scholars gradually began to recognize the depth and originality of his work. Thinkers in psychology, literature, theology, and philosophy discovered in Nietzsche a radical voice that anticipated modern crises of meaning. His concept of the death of God resonated in an increasingly secular Europe. His analysis of power influenced political theory. His psychological insights foreshadowed the work of Sigmund Freud. His emphasis on individual authenticity would inspire existentialists such as Jean-Paul Sartre. Ironically, the philosopher who died in obscurity would become one of the most influential thinkers of the 20th century. Part 4 of Nietzsche's life is marked by tragic contrast. On one side stands intellectual triumph, a body of work that redefined morality, truth, and individuality. On the other stands personal collapse, illness, isolation, and silence. Yet even his breakdown carries symbolic weight. Nietzsche had pushed thought to its limits. He confronted nihilism without retreat. He attempted to rebuild values in a world without divine foundation. The psychological strain of such radical confrontation may have been immense. When he collapsed in Turin, it was not simply a man who fell. It was the end of one of the most intense creative bursts in philosophical history. And yet, paradoxically, it was also the beginning. Because only after his voice was silenced did the world begin to hear him. Part 5. The Triumph After Silence, Nietzsche's Success, and the Legacy of a Radical Philosopher. Friedrich Nietzsche. When Friedrich Nietzsche died in 1900, he left the world in silence. For more than a decade before his death, he had lived in a state of mental collapse, unable to continue writing, thinking publicly, or defending his ideas. To many contemporaries, he seemed like a tragic footnote in German intellectual history, a brilliant but unstable thinker who had burned out too quickly. And yet history would tell a completely different story. Nietzsche's true success did not occur during his lifetime. It unfolded slowly, explosively, and globally after his death. His philosophy, once ignored, began to circulate among artists, psychologists, theologians, political theorists, and revolutionary thinkers. The very ideas that had seemed too radical for his era became prophetic for the 20th century. One of the key reasons for Nietzsche's posthumous rise was timing. The Europe of the early 1900s was entering a period of crisis. Traditional religious authority was weakening. Scientific progress challenged spiritual certainty. Political tensions were escalating. The First World War would soon shatter any remaining illusion of stable moral order. In this fractured environment, Nietzsche's diagnosis that God is dead and that Europe faced nihilism appeared uncannily accurate. His philosophy was no longer abstract. It felt urgent. Intellectual movements across Europe began rediscovering Nietzsche. Existentialist thinkers such as Jean-Paul Sartre and Martin Heidegger engaged deeply with his ideas. Heidegger in particular regarded Nietzsche as the last great metaphysician of the West, a thinker who both completed and dismantled traditional philosophy. Nietzsche's concept of self-creation resonated with existentialism's emphasis on individual responsibility in a world without guaranteed meaning. In psychology, his influence was equally profound. Sigmund Freud acknowledged Nietzsche's remarkable psychological insight. Nietzsche had already explored themes of repression, unconscious drives, and the hidden motivations behind moral behavior. His analysis of resentment, ressentiment, anticipated modern understandings of projection and psychological compensation. In literature, Nietzsche's impact was transformative. Writers and poets embraced his dramatic style and rebellious tone. He did not write like a traditional philosopher. He wrote in aphorisms, metaphors, and prophetic declarations. His language was alive, dangerous, emotionally charged. This stylistic power made his ideas accessible beyond academic circles. However, Nietzsche's rise was not without distortion. In the early 20th century, certain political movements misinterpreted his philosophy, particularly his concept of the Übermensch and the will to power. His sister, Elizabeth Forster Nietzsche, played a controversial role in editing and publishing his unfinished notes. She selectively presented his ideas in ways that aligned with nationalist and authoritarian ideologies. This misappropriation culminated in the misuse of Nietzsche's name during the rise of National Socialism in Germany. Although Nietzsche himself opposed anti-Semitism and nationalism, elements of his philosophy were distorted to support extremist narratives. After the Second World War, scholars worked intensively to correct these misinterpretations and recover the complexity of his thought. Once freed from ideological manipulation, Nietzsche's philosophical significance became even clearer. At the core of his success lies not a political doctrine, but a psychological and existential revolution. Nietzsche redefined what it means to live authentically. He argued that human beings must become creators of values, rather than passive inheritors of tradition. His call for self-overcoming challenges individuals to confront weakness, fear, and conformity within themselves. Unlike many philosophers who offer comfort, Nietzsche offers confrontation. He does not promise salvation, harmony, or universal equality. Instead, he demands strength, courage, and responsibility. His philosophy is not about escaping suffering, it is about transforming it. The concept of eternal recurrence remains one of the most powerful ethical challenges in modern thought. To live as though you would willingly repeat your life eternally requires radical affirmation. It eliminates regret as a guiding principle and replaces it with conscious choice. This idea continues to influence contemporary discussions of authenticity and purpose. Nietzsche's success also lies in his method. He dismantled the illusion of objective morality and revealed the role of power, psychology, and history in shaping values. This genealogical approach paved the way for later thinkers such as Michel Foucault, who expanded the analysis of power structures in society. More than a century after his death, Nietzsche remains one of the most quoted, debated, and studied philosophers in the world. His ideas circulate not only in academia, but in popular culture, self-development movements, political theory, and art. Why did he ultimately become who he became? His success was forged through isolation, illness, intellectual honesty, and relentless courage. He refused to accept inherited beliefs without questioning them. He broke with religion, severed ties with mentors, abandoned institutional security, and faced solitude without compromise. Nietzsche did not become influential by conforming. He became influential by risking everything intellectually. He confronted nihilism directly and refused despair. Instead of lamenting the death of God, he asked what humanity might become without divine authority. His answer was not simple optimism. It was a challenge. Become stronger, create meaning, affirm existence. In many ways, Nietzsche represents the philosopher of modernity itself, a thinker who anticipated the collapse of traditional certainty and dared to imagine what could follow. His life story is not one of conventional success. He did not achieve wealth, popularity, or institutional power. He died in obscurity and silence. But his intellectual courage reshaped the trajectory of Western thought. Today, Nietzsche stands not as a relic of the 19th century, but as a voice that continues to challenge contemporary society. In an age still wrestling with meaning, identity, power, and belief, his questions remain alive. The pastor's son became the critic of Christianity. The professor became the destroyer of moral absolutes. The isolated wanderer became one of the most influential philosophers in history. His success was not measured in applause during his lifetime. It was measured in the transformation of ideas long after his voice had fallen silent. And in that sense, Nietzsche achieved exactly what he once declared. He became dynamite.